Namaste, everyone, and welcome to Sustainable Narratives Fireside with Gad Saad, Professor of Evolutionary Psychology and author. We are here to discuss Gad's book, The Parasitic Mind: How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. I am extremely delighted to be here, and I hope that Gad and viewers at home from all around the world can share this delight with me. Gad, welcome to Sustainable Narratives.
Oh, it's so nice to be with you, Neeti. Thank you for having me.
Now, Gad, before we jump into the exploration of the parasitic mind, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? For our viewers at home, what exactly is an evolutionary psychologist?
Right. So an evolutionary psychologist is someone who applies evolutionary thinking to study the most important organ of our personhood, which is our mind. So evolutionists study why our pancreas are the way that they are, or our liver, or our heart. But in many cases, social scientists refuse to understand that the human mind didn't arise out of mysterious forces. It's not true that all other species are biological except human beings. And so what an evolutionary psychologist does is they take these evolutionary biological principles and they specifically apply them to understand why we are who we are. Why do we experience jealousy the way we do? How do we choose our mates? How do we choose products that try to ameliorate how we look in the mating market? And so basically what I do is I apply evolutionary biology to study consumer behavior.
Great stuff. I'm thinking I should maybe quit teaching and move to Canada and take up evolutionary psychology.
I'm always looking for inquisitive doctoral students, so come on board.
Oh, well, you might regret that. All right, so Gad, how about we dive deeper into the parasitic mind now? So let's introduce this book. How about you start telling us the central thesis of the parasitic mind?
So, you know, I faced two great wars in my life. The first war was the one coming out of Lebanon. We are Lebanese Jews. And so we were part of the last group of Jews that were in Lebanon. And when the civil war broke out, it was quite precarious to be Jewish in Lebanon. And so I faced the first year of the Lebanese civil war. And so I really got to understand the ugly part of identity politics and tribalism. The second war that I faced is the war on reason that I saw on university campuses, where whole fields, quote fields, were developing, and they were identifying themselves precisely because of their proud departure from reason and science and logic and common sense. And so in this book, what I do is I argue that in the same way that a whole host of animals can be parasitized by actual brainworms, meaning worms, parasites can actually go into this animal's brain and alter their behavior. So take, for example, a mouse. It could be infected by a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. When the mouse is infected with this parasite, it loses its innate fear of cats. It becomes actually sexually attracted to the cat's urine. And that, of course, doesn't result in a good outcome for the mouse if it runs towards the cat. And so I argue that human beings suffer from another class of brain parasites. I call them idea pathogens, bad ideas that in a sense can make us be the mouse running towards the cat. And so I first traced the origin of these parasites, these idea pathogens. Regrettably, they come from the university. It takes intellectuals to come up with really dumb ideas. And then after that, I trace how they propagated. And then I hopefully offer some vaccinations against this shoddy thinking.
Right. So you mentioned that universities are where these bad ideas kind of originate from. I mean, there are many people outside who actually think that universities are the hub of progression of mankind. So why are universities, according to you, Gad, the origination centers of these bad ideas?
So it depends on which idea pathogen we're talking about. So let's take specific ones so that our viewers can get a sense of what do I mean by an idea pathogen. So let's say postmodernism. I call this the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, because postmodernism basically argues that there are no objective truths. There's only subjective truths. We're always constrained by our subjective biases. And so there is my truth rather than the truth. Well, that in itself is deeply anti-scientific, because scientists wake up in the morning thinking that there is some truth to be uncovered that we can get close to. Scientists, though, are humble in that we recognize that all truths are provisional. What was true 500 years ago in science has been updated, may no longer be true. But we do operate under the premise that there are truths to be discovered. Postmodernism, on the other hand, is complete intellectual terrorism. It's nihilist. It basically says there are no truths. So that would be an example of a group of scholars trying to liberate themselves from the shackles of reality. Let's take another idea pathogen: biophobia, fear of biology and understanding human behavior. So there are a whole bunch of social sciences that have developed fields without ever recognizing that humans are biological beings. This speaks to the original question you asked me: what's an evolutionary psychologist? How could it be that we could study, out of 2 million species that we could study, 1,999,999,000 can be fully understood via biology, but somehow when it comes to human behavior, it transcends biology? That's insane, right? My hormones affect my decision-making. Your hormones affect, right? For example, I've studied how the menstrual cycle affects women's buying behaviors. Well, probably all the women viewers listening right now would say, no kidding, of course my hormones affect my behavior. Well, if you're a social scientist, it's news to you, because you're supposed to transcend your biology. So each of these idea pathogens, if you like, has evolved for a different reason, but what they all share in common is a deep desire to liberate themselves from reality. And that's insane. That's basically, you're murdering the truth in the pursuit of some ideological goal.
Right. And you're talking about postmodernism here, and saying that it's very relative. So if the world according to postmodernism is relative, and everything is a social construct, like you've said, and there is no truth whatsoever, then how do we know what is right or wrong? And what does this mean for the ethical side to being human?
Well, that's a great question. So there's a great story that I tell in The Parasitic Mind from Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, where he is at some conference and he's chatting with a bioethicist who is on the presidential advisory committee of, I think it was, I don't know if it was President Obama maybe. So she is a bioethicist. She specializes in studying these types of moral issues. And she was a moral relativist, in line with your question. And so Sam asks her, so let's say I told you that there was a people who, because of their religious doctrines, said something to the effect of every fourth child shall have its eyes gouged so that they can walk in darkness towards the light, or something like that. So would you think that that is okay? And she said, well, yeah, I mean, if that's their religious and moral imperative, who am I to judge? So this is another idea pathogen, right? Cultural relativism is quite grotesque, because it basically says that you could never take a deontological position. You could never say there is an absolute truth. Well, according to my moral compass, cutting off the clitorises of little girls, there is no context in the world where that should be allowed, where you should equivocate as to whether it's right or wrong. So that's a perfect manifestation of how an idea pathogen can have very dire consequences, in this case, to hundreds of millions of little girls around the world.
Right. Interesting. Now, going back to you saying that, universities are the originators of these bad ideas. Well, then why are professors? I mean, it's ironic we consider them to be, one of the smartest people. Why are these professors so vulnerable to these bad ideas? I mean, aren't they meant to be the smartest people?
I actually make this point in the book where I say the fact that you're educated doesn't inoculate you from terrible ideas. And as I said, the progenitors of these ideas are very educated people. So I think the best way to answer your question is to look at the types of professors who espouse these theories. Engineers or professors of engineering don't do that. Professors at business schools, I'm housed in a business school, don't do that. And the reason is because we are rooted in reality. We cannot have highfalutin ivory tower, excuse the acronym BS, because we are shackled by the consequences of our ideas. If you're a postmodernist engineer and you build a bridge thinking that there is no such thing as a universal truth called physics, then the bridge collapses. If I build a mathematical model to explain consumer choice that is completely decoupled from reality, I'm not going to be hired as a consultant very often. And so you end up having some members of academia who could espouse these insane ideas precisely because they could get away from decoupling their ideas from reality. So some folks in the humanities, some folks in the social sciences. Now, again, this is not a slight or an attack on the humanities, because you could be a very serious scholar in the humanities or in the social sciences, but you always have to be rooted in logic, in science, in reason. You can't position yourself as the anti-reason professor. And the reality is that's what happened in things like postmodernism. So if you take a text of, say, the classic French postmodernists, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, they're impenetrable. Now, they're impenetrable not because they're saying anything profound, because it's genuinely gibberish, but they masquerade it as full profundity. So just like the mathematician has an impenetrable language, well, why can't we, the postmodernists, also have an impenetrable language? It is intellectual terrorism. It has destroyed the lives of countless generations of students. It is useless. It has siphoned all the money from the parents who pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for students to receive completely useless degrees. And this is why I fight against it, because I'd like to think that I'm a defender of truth.
Oh, that you are. But let's dig deeper into
Sure.
this, Gad. So what makes an idea particularly infectious?
Again, it depends on which idea pathogen we're talking about. So if we draw an analogy with, say, COVID, right? Each virus has a different infection rate. Each virus has a completely different behavior, a different mortality rate. So not all idea pathogens are equally infectious, but I think what makes them alluring is, as I mentioned earlier, is that they are hopeful because they detach us from the shackles of reality. So earlier you mentioned the word social construction. That's a perfect example of a related idea pathogen. Social constructivism, to our viewers, is basically the idea that everything is due to a social construction. So, and related to that is the concept of tabula rasa. We're born with empty minds, and it's only socialization that makes us who we are. Well, that's a very hopeful message, because it basically says that your son, little Johnny, can become the next Lionel Messi or the next Albert Einstein or the next Michael Jordan. But the reality is your little son, Johnny, is not equally likely to become. He comes with a set of biological imperatives that make him more or less likely to instantiate each of these trajectories. But if I am a hopeful guy, kumbaya, John Lennon, imagine, singing along, I'd like to think that any child has equal potentiality. It's a hopeful message. Therefore, it's an infectious message, right? Similarly, let me give you another example. There is this, I can't remember, Dove, the Dove campaign of, we're all equally beautiful. There is no universal metric of beauty. Well, that's a very infectious selling point, because it convinces, in this case, the target market are women, that all types of women are equally beautiful. Well, the reality is that all kinds of women are equally worthy, but that doesn't mean that they are equally beautiful, right? I mean, we know, for example, from evolutionary psychology, that facial symmetry determines how beautiful people think you are. And this holds true across endless cultures. But if I come along and I am a cosmetic company and I can somehow convince you that it doesn't matter if you're 500 pounds, you're just as beautiful as Beyonce, because beauty is just, size is just the number, well, that makes me feel empowered, but it is a lie. It's much better much better for my physician to tell me, hey, Gad, you better lose some weight because there are some downstream consequences to you being obese, right? So each of these idea pathogens are terribly infectious, terribly viral, because they're hopeful, but they're BS.
So why is it that science or reasoning is unable to stand up to this sort of this approach of false empowerment, if I may call it? I'm probably using the wrong word, but why is it that science can't stand up to this BS, as we said?
Well, so I think it's because a lot of these messages are driven by our emotional system, our affective system. And again, so in one of the chapters of the Parasitic Mind, I talk about thinking versus feeling. And I actually argue that we shouldn't pit these things against each other. It's not that humans are driven by reason rather than emotions. This is a false premise. We are both an emotional animal and a thinking animal. The problem is when you activate the wrong system at the wrong occasion, right? If I'm trying to solve a calculus problem, triggering my affective system won't help me very much to solve a triple integral. On the other hand, when I'm walking down an alley and I see 4 suspicious-looking young guys loitering, maybe taking a different route, and hence this triggered my affective sense of fear, that was perfectly adaptive and evolutionarily relevant. So it's not that we should be thinking animals over emotional animals. It's that we shouldn't be using the wrong system at the wrong time. So the reason why sometimes, to answer your question in a hopefully not too long-winded way, it's not that reason is not winning out. It's that for most people, the message is triggering my affective sense. If I am a grossly overweight person, I'd love to hear that it's not true that women don't like guys with abs. They like guys with 43-inch waist. I want to hear that, but I'm lying to myself. This is also, by the way, something that I call in one of the chapters, ostrich parasitic syndrome. The metaphor of the ostrich that puts its head, even though it doesn't actually do that, but the metaphor means that you bury your head in the sand, you cover your ears and you go, la, 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 I don't want to hear the truth. That's effectively what's happening with many of these idea pathogens. It's allowing me to instantiate my desire for denial rather than being shackled by truth. And that's wrong.
And Gad, you also kind of go deeper into the DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equality. What is this? Can you elaborate more on this, please?
Yes, so I call it the DIE religion, to take your acronym, diversity, inclusion, equity. The DIE religion, again, comes from a noble place. It basically says, hey, look, we should try to create societies that are more diverse. Okay, nobody disagrees with that. That's wonderful. But what it does is it conflates or confuses equality of opportunities with equality of outcomes. We should fight so that we all have equality of opportunities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the downstream effect will result in equality of outcomes. So what the DIE religion does is that it takes, say, Martin Luther King's famous edict of, I want everybody to judge the character of my child based on who they are rather than the color of their skin. And it actually goes against that. It says, we are going to grant professorships based on immutable characteristics. Are you an indigenous person? Are you a transgender person? Are you a transgender person of color? Well, then that just shoots you up the hierarchy. It's grotesque, right? What makes our societies great is that we hopefully fight against institutional bigotry so that we create equality of opportunities, but then we let competition thrive. We let an ethos of meritocracy take over. But when I can no longer apply for a chaired professorship because I am not of the right skin color or the right gender expression, I mean, that is literally grotesque. So in the pursuit of social justice, we are imposing some fascist ideas. It's grotesque and it should stop.
So then would you say that radical feminism is also a DIE religion? If so, why?
Well, radical feminism, I would say, is an idea pathogen. Now, equity feminism, the idea that, hey, women should be equal under the law, and if we see any institutional barriers for women to flourish to their full potential, then we intervene. And I think we certainly have done a very good job at that. The problem with radical feminism is that in its pursuit of that laudable goal, it again murders the truth. So it says there are no innate differences between the sexes. And now we even don't have such thing as sexes. We have 873 genders, right? So it should never be the case. Like, I should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I should be able to pursue social justice and be a truth seeker. I don't murder the truth so that I can pursue a laudable social justice goal. So the average 2-year-old knows, and I'm not being hyperbolic, the average 2-year-old knows, and I have young children, so I see it in both my son and daughter, they understand biological sex. They identify themselves based on their sex. They identify others, even inanimate objects. In French, it's a gendered language. In Arabic, it's a gendered language. So our brains are equipped to understand the world through the dichotomy of gender or binary gender. But now it is transphobic to say that. So the problem with, for example, trans activism or radical feminism is in their pursuit of social justice, they depart so far from reason that it becomes a collective psychosis. And again, I'm a strong proponent of trans rights, but I don't have to negate biology to be a trans ally. Same thing for radical feminism.
But I mean, someone could then turn around and say to you that, you know, we live in a democratic country, to each their own, right? It's their opinion. Why do we need to constantly challenge them?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Did you finish?
No, please continue.
They have a right to spew their BS, and I have a right to counter their BS. We both have those rights. I think the problem is that when you're a professor espousing that stuff, regrettably, your students are oftentimes don't have the intellectual fortitude to challenge you. So they sit quietly. So I receive 1 million emails, and it's probably not too hyperbolic to say 1 million. I probably receive many, many thousands of emails from students, from professors who say, hey, Professor Saad, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do when I hear some of the insanity in my class. What should I do? Well, that's wrong. So if you want to spew your stuff, then I should certainly be in a free society able to counter your stuff. Let the best ideas win. The problem is, and which always happens with ideological fascism, is that it becomes wrong. It becomes transphobic to argue against it. It becomes misogynistic to argue against radical feminism. It becomes Islamophobic to critique some tenet of Islam that no liberal person should support. So this is how you then keep people silent, because there's nothing worse in the West than to be accused of being intolerant and bigoted. And the fascists have recognized this. So unlike in the Middle East, where I come from, where we kill you for what you say, if we don't like it, here we will kill your reputation. We will kill your career. We will cancel you. Both are grotesque. And if the silent majority were to develop the courage to speak up against this, we can quickly redress the ship. If they don't, oftentimes I receive emails from people, oh, I love so much what you do, Dr. Saad, but please don't mention my name if you share my email with anybody. Well, the fact that you're saying, please don't mention my name, that's why we have this problem. Your cowardice, your silence is what's keeping us in this corner, all, you know, in a fetal position. Speak up, challenge the idiocy, and hopefully truth will win.
So an example of this, could you say, and I'm going to take a liberty of referring to one of your YouTube videos,
Sure.
where you're talking about the Harry Potter author, J.K. Rowling, and her recent tweet about menstruation or
Yes.
women menstruating. So would you say that's an example of the West and it being considered homophobic or transphobic or misogynistic, or to kind of post your ideas out?
Right. Yes, perfect example. So in 2017, I'm going to come to the J.K. Rowling by a roundabout way. In 2017, I was asked to appear in front of the Canadian Senate because the government had tabled a bill called Bill C-16, which was a bill seeking to incorporate gender expression and gender identity under the rubric of hate crimes. And I was trying to warn the government that the slippery slope of totalitarianism is a very, very slippery one, right? So this is what I call the tyranny of the minority, right? 0.01% of folks who really do exist, who should be protected under law, are called transgender. That doesn't mean that in the pursuit of seeking the laudable goal of protecting them, we should reject reality. Excuse me, I'm going to use colorful language, but it's valuable. Men who have 9-inch penises but who identify as women are not called women. It is not true that boys too can menstruate. Girls who self-identify as boys menstruate. So when someone like J.K. Rowling could be canceled or attempt to be canceled because she says something as terribly banal as, come on, are you truly saying that boys can menstruate? If that is a cancelable offense, then we are already deep into the abyss of infinite lunacy.
So now that we're on the topic of social media, how are these bad ideas spreading so far and wide and out of the university at this point? And to reference the J.K. Rowling situation, what role does social media platforms play in these idea pathogens, or bad ideas as we call them?
Yeah, well, the social media, regrettably, I mean, social media is both a wonderful tool and a terrible tool. It's wonderful in that it allows people to connect with one another who otherwise would have never had a chance to connect. I've had a chance to become friends with my childhood musical hero, the lead singer of a famous soul group called the Stylistics. This guy would sing in my ears when I was growing up in Beirut, and 40 years later, he's come on my show. I visited him in Philadelphia. I can't believe that I'm actually interacting with this guy who was my, as I said, my childhood. And that came through the power of social media. So social media is a wonderful opportunity for us to connect, just like we are connecting right here via Zoom. But also social media allows the truly socially justice active warriors to silence the rest of us in fear, right? It's not that social justice warriors outnumber the rest of us. Because oftentimes I get someone who writes to me and they say, but aren't you exaggerating the numbers of how many of these lunatics there are on campus? And I say, no. How many people did it take to bring down the Twin Towers at 9/11? It wasn't 19 million people who did it. It was 19 people who were very committed in their religious zealotry. And the landscape of New York has forever more changed. It didn't take 190,000 people. It took 19 people. So on campuses, you don't need more than 50, 100 very committed social activists to keep the rest of us cowering in fear. And this is exactly what happens on social media. There is the e-mob that's saying, hey boy, hey girl, watch what you say. Don't criticize Black Lives Matter, because if you do, we're coming for you and we're going to cancel you. What do most people do? They keep quiet, and therefore the nefarious ones spread their message.
Okay, so Gad, if these bad ideas are viruses, then we can understand the source now. We're understanding the source of these idea pathogens. But why is the Western society so prone to these bad ideas? And is our Western culture in a state of self-loathing? And I'm going to call it self-flagellating because you mention it and you refer to it. I
even self-flagellate on camera very often.
Yes, with the Joaquin Phoenix. I've seen that video and I enjoyed it very much, I must say.
But not too much. I hope you didn't enjoy it too much. But maybe. Okay. So one of the tools that I use in my persuasion strategies, I use satire. And so I've taken it to often mock, so to speak to your question, the deep self-loathing of the West. It's really become part of the signature of being a true progressive to basically say, I am really bad. My ancestors were really bad. My culture really sucks. So there's a real interesting irony here, because at the individual, and I discuss this in the Parasitic Mind, at the individual level, if you go see a therapist and you suffer from deep low self-esteem or self-loathing, that is considered something that we should try to intervene to change. It's not a good thing to be an individual who is deeply enmeshed in self-loathing. But paradoxically, if at the collective level, if at the societal level, we now engage in orgiastic self-flagellation, my God, that makes me truly progressive. I hate my skin color. I hate the West. I hate colonialism, right? Well, the reality is no culture that's ever existed is perfect. No human being is perfect. There are historical realities that we could look back at and feel sorry for, but we don't wallow in that. We move on. We recognize it and we move on. As someone who fled Lebanon, today is July 4th, the Independence Day of the United States. There has never been a culture, a society that is more free than the United States. Does that mean that it's perfect? No. But it certainly does mean that of all the buffet of societies that have ever existed, this is the one that has meted out the most happiness and freedom to the most number of people. There's nothing to feel self-loathing about. You should feel nothing but pride. If that's true at the individual level, it should also be true at the group level. And so to answer your question, the reason why it is easy to be parasitized by these idea pathogens is because we have been taught that to be self-loathing is to be progressive. It isn't. It's to be weak and moronic.
Wow. Speaking of this, Gad, I want to kind of drive the conversation back to when you mentioned the ostrich parasitic syndrome. I believe I'm saying that correctly. So you mentioned that earlier. Is this what is happening with the discussion about Islam? We had a discussion earlier, a fireside conversation, and we were discussing Islam and women in the religion. So why is it that this is such a taboo topic in the West? Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a whole chapter on this in the Parasitic Mind. I think it comes from, again, a noble place where people feel that it is gauche, it is wrong to criticize someone's religion, especially if that religion is not, the local dominant religion, right? So it's somehow racist, it's bigoted. No, I'm Jewish, but I could recognize that in Deuteronomy, one of the 5 Mosaic books in the Old Testament, there is stuff in there that if we implemented, they are grotesque. Take your insolent children to the gate of the city and stone them to death if they are insolent is not a very good moral prescription. I could recognize the grotesqueness of that edict without someone accusing me of being anti-Semitic, right? So by the same logic, most Westerners have been convinced, and it kind of speaks to the earlier cultural relativism and self-loathing, they've been convinced that to criticize Islam is tantamount to being bigoted. That is an astronomically obnoxious and grotesque idea. No ideology is outside the purview of scrutiny, of mockery, of ridicule. That's what makes us free societies. If you don't like that, then you could live under Sharia law. You don't have to immigrate. But once you immigrate to the West, where we live supposedly under freedom, then you have to accept that Judaism is up for mockery, feminism is up for mockery, Gad Saad's theories are up for mockery. Nobody is above, nobody is sacrosanct. But when you come from cultures where you are in the 99% majority, where no one has ever criticized your religion, and you come to the West where people have a tradition of mocking everything, then you say, no, you're offending me. You have no right to do that. Of course I have a right to do that. There is a book called, there's a play called The Book of Mormons that has huge box office receipt. The whole thing is about mocking Mormonism. How many people have been killed due to Mormonism? There's if you remember the guy in 1987, the famous artist, his name escapes me right now, he took a crucifix with Christ and put it inside his urine in a glass like this, and that was considered art. You're taking something that is revered by 2+ billion Christians and you are putting it in your urine. Try to do that with Islam. What would happen to you? So is there something that makes Islam above criticism, that it is above scrutiny, above mockery? No. The reality is that if I were saying something that incited hatred towards individual Muslims, that is wrong. That's off limits. But if I am to criticize Islamic tenets, that's perfectly okay. So we have to recognize the difference between attacking individuals, which is wrong, and attacking ideas, which is okay for everything. Nothing is above criticism. So I think that's the reason why people get that itchy feeling or that uncomfortable feeling when it comes to Islam, and it has to be removed, because if not, some really nefarious folks are very keen to muzzle our voices.
Okay, interesting. So moving the conversation forward now, we're currently in a pandemic, and we're talking about parasitic ideas, these idea pathogens. Gad, what would you say? What is the vaccine for humanity? How can we inoculate ourselves? I mean, within the Hindu culture, we have something called Vivek. This means how one ought to differentiate between those things that help us to flourish and those things that will diminish us in some way. Reasoning is quite central to Hindu traditions. I think there is something similar to this that you advocate in the book, The Parasitic Mind, as to what should be done. Can you tell me what the solution is to these idea pathogens, to these to the parasitic mind?
Sure. Well, I just learned something. What did you call it? Vivek?
Vivek, yes.
Yeah.
V-I.
Vivek?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have to look into that. Thank you for teaching me that. So I basically argue in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, I offer some more prescriptions. In chapter 7, I use a technique which I call cumulative nomological networks of cumulative evidence. And it's a fancy term, so let me kind of break it down. So if we go back to Charles Darwin, more than 150 years ago, he published On the Origin of Species in 1859 to demonstrate his theory of natural selection. How does speciation come about? How do species evolve to appear to be so perfectly adapted to their environments? Well, the way that he developed his theory is through a very careful, assiduous collection of evidence stemming several decades and coming from many, many different disciplines, from geology, from paleontology, from animal husbandry, from entomology. And so it wasn't a singular source of data that allowed him to build his impenetrable defense for his theory, but rather it was many lines of evidence coming from many different sources, so that it becomes very difficult to falsify him precisely because he's built a tsunami of evidence. So I take this, if you like, this principle, and I formalize it into what I call cumulative and nomological networks of cumulative evidence. So for example, if I want to demonstrate to you that toy preferences have a biological element, in other words, the toys that little boys are more likely to prefer and the toys that the little girls are more likely to prefer is not just due to social construction. There is a biological element. Well, how would I go about convincing you of that? What would be the data that I would need to show you to prove to you that my position is right? Well, I can get data from developmental psychology, where I take children who are too young to be socialized. By definition, they couldn't have been socialized. Their brains have not yet developed to be socialized. And I could show you that little girls and little boys already exhibit those sex-specific toy preferences. I could take other animals. I could bring vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees and show you that those other animals also exhibit the same sex-specific preferences that human infants exhibit. So in one case, I gave you developmental psychology. In the other case, I gave you comparative psychology. I could bring you data from ancient Greece, where in the funeral monuments, the way that little children are depicted is exactly in the same sex-specific ways. The girls are playing with dolls, the boys are playing with balls, and so on. So in other words, I systematically can bring you data from across cultures, across time periods, across disciplines, all of which point to the same final conclusion, so that I have now built an edifice of insurmountable evidence to prove my point. And so what I try to tell people, going back to the earlier point about thinking versus feeling, if you are debating someone, don't succumb to emotions. Don't succumb to hysteria. When someone asks me a question, say about climate change, I don't know enough about climate change, so I exhibit the due humility. I'm sorry, I don't know enough climate change to make a position. I don't know. But if you ask me something about something that I'm very comfortable with, I will drown you in the amount of data that I have to support my position. And so I try to tell people, think that way. Learn how to construct arguments the way an evolutionist would, because it is truly a wonderful epistemological tool to use to navigate through many of these difficult issues. Did I give you, was that clear, or do you need any more?
No, that was very clear, and I'm sure the viewers understood it much better, just like me. So how can the common man in a fast-paced world really get such diverse perspectives? Do we rely on experts, but then these could be, but then, like you said, these experts are prone to these bad ideas, these idea pathogens. How does the common man deal with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, if the person in question is so parasitized by Usher's parasitic syndrome that they have their hands and their fingers and their ears going la la la, I don't want to listen to you, then in a sense they're impenetrable. So the first step is you have to at least be open to receiving that information, those nomological networks that I spoke about. If you are open to that, the reality is that we now have the democratization of knowledge, right? Imagine 5,000 years ago, the rabbis knew how to read. The rest of us commoners couldn't even read the holy books. I'm sure it's the same thing in Hinduism. It's right. So the priestly class were the ones who would relay the information to us. Today we have this grand priest called Google, right, who can very quickly make me just as knowledgeable about some particular medical condition I have than the person who went to medical school. So the reality is the information is there. You can access Google Scholar. If you want to know whether marijuana, the legalization of marijuana is going to result in a greater likelihood of people becoming drug addicted, well, you can do yourself as a common person. You don't have to be an academic. You could look to sources, open sources that can hopefully help you build these nomological networks. The problem is that it requires effort, right? To build the evidence that Darwin built took him several decades, right? So as you said, in a fast-paced world, I'd rather use some fast and frugal heuristic, a shortcut, right? So if Obama says that, or Bush says that Islam is peace, then I just accept that rather than doing my own research to see, well, is Islam peaceful or is it not peaceful? So the reality is that the data is there for you to get it, but you have to have the commitment. So I don't expect that people are going to build these nomological networks for every issue. But for really important issues, you're trying to decide which presidential candidate to vote for. That's a consequential issue. So rather than choosing the one who looks more presidential or who is taller, by the way, that's the type of heuristics that people use. They don't sit and worry about what is the true position of someone. Trump is grotesque, he's vulgar, therefore I hate him. Barack Obama is tall and he has a radiant smile and he's slender, therefore he's elegant and noble. That's the kind of stupidity that people use to judge politicians. No, spend 3 hours and collect the necessary data to make an informed decision.
Gad, I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I'm sure our viewers right now are on Amazon to pre-order their own copy of The Parasitic Mind. We're now just a few minutes before the end. The time's just flown by, like we discussed before we went live. For our audience watching, do you have any final thoughts to share with them?
I would say the following. Don't subcontract your voice to others in the battle of ideas. Every single person has a voice that they can use to affect change. Yes, you don't have to be a fancy professor with a big platform for you to weigh in. If someone says something on Facebook that you find objectionable, challenge them politely. If your professor says something that seems to be a complete departure from reason, put up your hand and challenge them. Everybody has the capacity to use their voice to try to weigh in on these issues. The problem is that most people are either too cowardly or they feel that they don't have a sufficiently strong voice to air out their ideas. I would say, please don't do that. Your voice matters, get engaged, and hopefully we can return to reason, science, and common sense.
Great. Now, I don't want to give too much of the book away in case people want to delve deeper into the concept of idea pathogens and the solutions that you offer. Gad, I can talk to you for the next 2 hours on the parasitic mind, but like I said, I'm conscious of time, and we will unfortunately have to bring our thoughtful exploration of your book to an end. Thank you very much for taking the time out this evening and speaking to our audience, Gad.
Thank you so much. You were a delightful conversationalist. Thank you.
And thank you very much to our viewers at home for joining us this evening. And I hope you will continue these conversations in your own circles. I'd like to also take this opportunity to remind our viewers at home of our upcoming events for tomorrow. Tomorrow is a new day with new narratives, understanding and reimagining stories that shape humanity. Starting with a fireside conversation with Shashi Tharoor at 1 p.m. BST, discussing Global Order 2050. We are the biggest challenges that face humanity. What are the biggest challenges that face humanity over the next 30 years? Later on, at 3 p.m. British Summer Time, we will be joined by Professor Lou Marinoff, Amish Tripathi, and Makrand Paranjape for our VM on culture and literature in a postmodern world. And finally, at 6 p.m. BST, we will be in conversation with Anirudh Rajput, Lou Marinoff, and Matthew McManus, discussing, can rights be sustainable without a set of duties? Thank you once again for joining this fireside, and I hope to see just as many of you joining throughout the rest of tomorrow. Namaste.